So for the Transcendent Knowledge podcast episode number 24, I thought that now that I've had a chance to really properly listen to the last episode recording and really hear all about your conception of prohibition culture that you were describing, now that I've really digested that, I wanted to respond to it and just add my thinking into the mix and see what you think about that. So, I mean, the overall theme of the whole thing, as far as I understand it, is basically characterizing prohibition and prohibition culture as an ego-preserving strategy designed to perpetuate the possibilism, ordinary state of consciousness, and the result, the mental world model based on possibilism in the ordinary state, by protecting it from the revelation of psychedelic eternalism. And there's different ways that the prohibition culture achieves that aim. And also another major theme of the last recording was where pop-psychedelia fits inside the structure of prohibitionist culture, and just saying how it's not adopting a radical anti-prohibition or prohibition repeal approach to the issue of prohibition, but rather an approach which is based on incremental change, largely compliant to the current structure of prohibition, but just seeking to modify it slightly to allow some kind of psychedelic practice to continue without the challenging, dramatic eternalism revelation.
That's an analogy I was trying to draw between pop psychedelia's unradical approach to mental model conversion, its lack of interested in eternalism and passing through that ego death gateway into the eternalism barrier, or into the eternalism realm, there's an analogy between that and their approach to prohibition, which is generally not very radical, and then more broadly with the prohibition culture, whether this results directly from prohibitionist laws or prohibitionist laws reflect the culture. Those are bigger questions that I'm not really concerned with, but that there's something in a lot of prohibitionist culture that I observe that is also analogous to the egoic state's desire and fervent work to avoid that ego death gateway. So things are characterized especially by that avoidance of ego death and putting up of other goals, and either shutting it off completely or putting up other goals, or not allowing discourse about it to enter, to really be prevalent or prominent or part of the official culture, so to speak.
Right. So there's a very strong theme at the center of all this, which is the desire to avoid the discovery of eternalism, to forever put off that discovery. And what we see is that prohibition culture, the prohibitionist society, either reflects that or causes that desire to avoid ego death, eternalism revelation, but also that pop psychedelia manifests that a clear expression of that desire to avoid ego death. And then additionally, a third perspective is the James Kent perspective, which we have, so thoroughly fleshed out, describe where James Kent is coming from. He too his thinking aligns with the logic of prohibition, which is to say the logic of supporting the desire to avoid ego death.
Mm-hmm. You must maintain control.
Right. And then there's our approach, which is to see ego death as a crucially important tool and rite of passage in life, and a way of understanding the true meaning of religion and about how self-control and time function. So for us, we put the ego death revelation in central place as a goal, something which is desirable, at least intellectually desirable, and for a complete understanding of time, self-control, and religion, ego death is a required element. And so our point of view contrasts very much with these three things, which is, one is the standard conservative prohibition theme in culture, and pop psychedelia and James Kent's anti-pop psychedelia within that. Those are all prohibition-aligned, prohibition-compliant structures.
Right. And just to, I think when we talk about pop psychedelia, there are, that really means like with the kind of approaches that we have analyzed in this podcast, there are instances, of course, of an interest in ego death within kind of the pop world in general, mass culture, popular culture. But when we're really talking about the kind of the leading discourse of among psychedelics advocates, I think that I'm in some way accepting James Kent's framing of who the so-called psychedelic community are, of psychedelics advocates, and the leading voices have for the past few decades been essentially, my view is that they're essentially prohibition compliant, even as they want to legitimate or legalize in some form. Their approach is one that assumes the framing of prohibition.
You just mentioned there that there are places in society other than us and our discourse on the ego death theory which are interested in ego death genuinely, but you didn't give any examples. What did you have in mind? Are you thinking music or something like that?
I'm thinking music. Yes, that's something that I spend a lot of time with, is music and lyrics, and across many genres, in fact. And there are other examples that we or Michael Hoffman have identified as being interested in the themes or the topics of ego death, and eternalism, movies, for example. So it's not that this is this totally thing that's completely shut out, but it's put off as taboo and not kind of discouraged. I would say probably more generally, as time goes on, especially.
So I vaguely recall reading a comment Michael Hoffman wrote, saying he used the term artisan. He said that in the modern culture, artisans are permitted to explore deep psychedelic experiencing and ego death. So the two examples you just gave, music and movies, they both fit within that that overall theme of artistic expression. Is that where all of it is? I mean, is there anything outside of art, like music and movies, where you think that there is a genuine interest and reflection of deep ego death dynamics, or is it just art?
There could be, it's a big world. There could be more in, say, one could imagine that within religious practices, for example. One could imagine the all those old forms and images being re-inspired and kind of re-injected with meaning within various religious traditions and mythologies. One could imagine that. One could imagine that in literature. I suppose I've been reading a lot. I've been planning to do something at my website, but I've been reading a lot of comic books by Alan Moore recently, and he's very interested in fact, explicit about being interested in eternalism and in psychedelics. And it's still kind of a question of what precisely does he understand eternalism by? But it's quite interesting. He uses the term. He talks about Einstein, the block universe, and he's very explicit about using psychedelics to make his comics, not as the sole input, but as a major input. So there's a literary example, also a visual art example in the comic book form.
Sure. Okay.
So I think that there's, again, it's not that. But what I want to say actually about art is that I think that there's an increasing. My sense, though, is that there's an increasing discourse about art in America, at least, that art needs to be safe. It needs to be it needs to be safe. It shouldn't offend anyone, and it shouldn't be problematic for anyone. And I think that this also poses a problem then for art being a place to explore and talk about the like death of identity and death of self and problem of self-control loss and things like that. It's a problem for metaphor and use of images. So I do think that that realm is under a certain criticism that's pretty widespread amongst like discussion and critique and online discourse.
So do you think that would constitute a pressure on artists to censor or to comply with prohibitionist rhetoric?
Well, I think that, none of it calls out directly drugs or the problem of ego death itself, but there is a larger... I haven't observed it being directly about, say, psychedelics or... well, of course, there's pressure on artists to censor psychedelics. There has been for a long time. But the larger question is a pressure to censor ego death themes. And I think that what I primarily observe is a pressure on artists to censor certain images or topics, or to to censor certain images and topics that could be viewed as people could find offensive, and that leads to a narrowing of the possibilities of metaphor and what metaphor we can use. Things that might endanger people or promote dangerous ideas there's a general climate I've noticed in a fair amount of discourse, both online and in the academy, about the problems of literature or of art, and it's, what it represents. And it should only have, a lot of people think it should only have certain people think artists should only portray or represent things in a positive manner. And so my criticism there's a great narrowing of the metaphorical possibilities to express all the great themes found in ego death initiation and transcendence.
I think maybe it has the effect of encouraging metaphor as a way of hiding what the metaphor is about. So you can describe the ego death themes and the taboo themes, but hide them behind a veil of metaphor. Like, I think that's been the function in religion to some extent, is the metaphor hides what it's really about, as opposed to revealing it or describing the thing it's about. So artists can get away with things if they're not too explicit, like if they don't make explicit references to drugs. Like, for example, the movie The Matrix, for example, it has this thing of the red pill or the blue pill. That's the only thing that Neo really puts inside his body. So they don't say what's in the pill. They don't say what it's made of, anything like that. It steers clear of explicit references, but on the metaphor level, it's clear what it's all about.
Right.
So there's that. But also in the last episode, we were also talking about the idea of a post-prohibition society, and also about the transition, the manner of transition from the current prohibitionist situation to some sort of post-prohibition configuration of the society, and what that would involve. And then again, you come up with the two contrasting points of view about what that could mean. So you've got the kind of tiptoeing, overly cautious pop-psych prohibition-compliant approach, which you characterized as incremental change, where you just make very slight, tiny modifications to the current system to allow a bit of psychedelic usage, but kept under control and kept below the level of radical transformation. Or there's the Michael Hoffman style of radical reform, prohibition, repeal, make prohibition illegal. The absolute opposite of that, where everything at once, the change in society is immediate and complete, in that manner. And the question arises, what would actually be different in a post-prohibition society compared to now? So I guess, one prohibitionist fear, or prohibition engendered fear, would be that the major difference between pre-prohibition and post-prohibition is that suddenly the hospitals are full of people who are freaking out on psychedelics, because as soon as they're made illegal, everybody goes out and uses them, and then their true danger is revealed and that kind of thing. So that's the prohibitionist view about what would be different in a post-prohibition society. But then there's also the non-prohibition influenced rational speculation about what post-prohibition society would look like. And that was something that we discussed. And there's different views of what that might be, ranging from some kind of extreme transformation of the way that human beings relate to each other and live their lives and do business with each other. So we brought up there was a reference to a science fiction movie called They Live, which says that when you see through the illusion of capitalist society, you want to go and bring about a kind of communist revolution. And that maybe if everybody would take psychedelics, we would all want to be more compassionate and sharing with each other, and there would be some kind of collectivist style revolution. But there's no real reason to believe that, in light of what one observation is that, as far as I know, the Soviet Union and communist China prohibit psychedelics in exactly the same way, if not more so, in fact, than Western capitalist society. So there's no real justification. Perhaps that's just wishful thinking on the part of socialist activists to think that psychedelic drugs would support their ends instead of being either neutral in the capitalism-communism debate or else supporting capitalism in some sense. So there's that possibility of what psychedelic legalization could result in terms of the societal structure. And there could be different forms of that. It could be some kind of revolution, but not communist themed. It might be, I think, turning to Terence McKenna's thinking, he had some kind of idea that in psychedelic society, we would all learn to live, again, this is pretty collectivist, but because he was such a mono-plant person and he focused so much on mushrooms, he characterized the societal change as being somehow learning to live more like mushrooms and, feeding off of, being at the bottom of the food chain, being vegan, perhaps. Also, so feminism, he wove into his narrative about what psychedelics could do to a society. He said that he equated ego as a masculine thing, so psychedelics coming into society would diminish masculine ego and make society more feminine. So that's another possibility of this projection, this anticipation of what a psychedelic world, post-prohibition world, would look like. But then I think that when you and I analyse it and think about it, we are more inclined to minimise this kind of talk of a societal shift, some kind of transformation in ordinary daily life. And actually, we're inclined to say that there's no reason that hardly anything would necessarily change other than simply the fact that drugs would be available from legal channels. So we've gone through several examples of that. So there's no reason why trade couldn't continue as normal. People buy and sell from each other. That seems to be pretty much fundamental human activity around the world, trading things. Also things like sport, they would all carry on fine in a world where psychedelic drugs were legal and integrated into at the root of society. But there's one thing that isn't, and I think that it was mentioned in the last episode, but I don't feel that we fully explain the issue, which is obviously religion. What would actually happen to religion in a society that had moved beyond prohibition? Because it strikes me that it would render exoteric religion completely meaningless and pointless and on a par with believing in Santa Claus or something, explanatorily redundant when you see what's really going on. And that may or may not be a significant and noticeable and far-reaching change in the society. So I just wondered, like, what your thoughts on that is. There's another issue there, I suppose, which is to what extent does a transformation in religion post-prohibition also depend on a widespread uptake of the ego death theory? Because that's another thing that may or may not happen even if prohibition comes to an end and psychedelic drugs become widely socially accepted and available. So have you got any thoughts about that, about how religion is affected post-prohibition?
There's a lot of great thoughts on what you just said. Now, I think that so I'm at a quandary on where to start. Well, again, I think the general topic of deflating expectations is important. Like you mentioned, there's a lot of overblown expectations and a lot of stuff that has been... psychedelics have been asked to do a lot of things and carry a lot of weight almost automatically. Like, if only... oftentimes, I have heard people say, if only so-and-so, if only more people would take psychedelics, then the world would be a better place. But I think that's kind of a pipe dream and not, and I think more and more people are starting to say that's not really, psychedelics don't really have an inherent political or social agenda to them. That it can seem that way while someone is in the state based upon their own predilections, but I think they're kind of politically or socially without content, or they can be fit into a number of different roles. That's one idea that comes from if you adopt the idea that psychedelic use is widespread, for example, in history, well, you've got to then explain how different social setups occurred under psychedelics. If you also hold the idea that they promote one specific social setup. So you have democracy doing it, and then you also have a monarchy doing it, and I think the better conclusion there is that they can be used to help promote any sort of setup if you want to. The use of the altered state or the use of... same thing goes with religion and divinity. Those concepts have been used to promote different hierarchical models and egalitarian models. So that's just a kind of roundabout way of saying, yes, I agree that I don't think there's much we can count on directly. It still depends on people's efforts and ideas. And so, but I think another topic having to do with imagining a post-prohibition future is also having a kind of, what model do we have about the pre-prohibition period, and what is, now that we've gone through prohibition, is it relevant to think that we can just rewind back to a pre-prohibition period? Is that how things are going to be like? And I'm not sure that is really the case either. Now, with the maximal entheogen theory of religion, so to speak, that subset of the ego death theory, we assume that the entheogens are present throughout human history and human culture, widespread throughout human cultural practice, but are themselves, them and the altered state are veiled and kept away from... They're veiled in some way. It's kind of an open secret to preserve the initiation, the features of initiation.
Right.
So you hide it from the youth, and you have a kind of rhetoric of insiders and outsiders to keep that, again, to preserve the ego death experience and also shape and direct initiation. It kind of seems to me, if you look at, there's all sort of different initiation systems also have different societal setups attached to them that then push the individual initiated to kind of be part of that social system. This is how one way that societies help themselves, reinforce themselves, keep themselves ongoing. And so if we imagine a post-prohibition future with the ego death theory, now that's an interesting topic you brought up. What if there's repeal of prohibition? What happens? Does that include the ego death theory or not? I mean, we can't assume that more people will take it up at all.
And if they don't, does that have a bearing on whether or not exoteric religion has a viable future in the world, a viable place in the world, depending on whether or not the ego death theory comes to be widely recognized?
I know, it's like, could we almost say, I'm playing around with different ideas here just to try them out. I mean, could we almost say that we need to, for the purpose of maintaining esoteric religion, what is the effect of making psychedelics widespread again?
Yeah, because there's for example, all these church buildings and institutions. So, for example, in churches where they carry out the Christian Eucharist, do they carry on doing that? Or because there's obviously one possibility is that the genuine sacrament would actually enter into the heart of the exoteric institutions, so that at the weekly meetings they have where they give out the literal bread and wine, they would actually substitute that for the psychedelic bread and wine. That seems very hard to imagine. That seems like a very big social change, because then you'd have a situation where in all these ordinary religious meetings everybody would be tripping out. But that's certainly, to what extent, again, coming back to the theme of using metaphor as a way of hiding what the metaphor is really about, to what extent can the metaphor continue to be taken seriously in its own right? Or to what extent does metaphor simply disappear if there's no prohibition? Is there a function of metaphor post-prohibition?
I think that there is, because it's inherent to the state of the switch between the two states, or it's inherent to that transition or that flip between the two. I think it has to go on in a certain way. The function goes on because if psychedelics are illegal and easily available, they're not. That doesn't mean that everyone is suddenly tripping all the time. And it doesn't mean that we have forgotten or lost there is a certain kind of modernity's metaphor, work to de-emphasize metaphor or to literalize metaphor. That's something I associate with the kind of the European Enlightenment project in a certain way, is this goal to de-emphasize metaphor and literalize it and move away from it. There are important lessons there and for thinking and thought. And I don't think that we would lose all of that. I think that's part of the, one point with the ego death theory is to get a conception of both realms, a very clear conception of both realms as two distinct areas, the ordinary state and its literal interpretation, and the altered state and its high-powered metaphor interpretive apparatus. And so would that just go away? I think it's possible that we would see a great, if prohibition was suddenly repealed, we would probably start to see a lot of different groups, I think, experimenting with different conceptions of religion and different practices. And I think then you would enter a time of probably increasing public debate about it, about the role of metaphor and the role of psychedelics and the role of these plants in history. I mean, another important thing about prohibition and modernity and the veiling of, the hidden not illegalization, but the way psychedelics are put off and hidden and made taboo, is that we then become accustomed to seeing them that way throughout the history of human culture. We see them as something that are naturally put off and naturally hidden and not present. They're rare and deviant and not normal. And And there's the great question is, well, to what extent, how do we read the history of human culture and answer that question to the extent to which the psychedelics or other visionary plants were used throughout human culture and practice and history. And I think we could expect, like, within religions, a period of debate and experimentation about those topics, how to integrate them, and a debate about to what extent they were already integrated. Now we've kind of, like, with our post Michael Hoffman, or, having absorbed his work, we kind of assume already that they were the origin and wellspring, but there's a lot of people who need to have that argument set before them and work out what that means for themselves, lots of practices and practitioners.
So in a situation where the end of prohibition has happened first, then religion finds itself in a situation where it has to kind of figure out its own meaning all over again. And there will be this new way of interpreting what religion is about that will enter into the picture, probably, in likelihood. People will start to wonder to a greater extent whether or not psychedelic drugs played a role in the history of religion.
I think we could expect more debate about that, yes. More public debate about that.
And then I guess the question is that what would the outcome of that debate be? And I guess what you and I would hope is that during the course of that debate, the ego death theory would start to stand out as a potential explanatory contender for how it all works, how psychedelic drugs and religion fits together. So then it's just a case of, would that come to be adopted and accepted as a mainstream overall view of what religion is or not? Or would the discourse succeed in identifying the ego death theory as you and I have, or would the discourse never get that far?
I think one thing that I would hope for is not so much that metaphor would disappear. There's a lot of great... metaphor is enjoyable. I think it's really enjoyable to decode and to see different ways of capturing those core ego death concepts in images and words. So personally, I wouldn't want it to go away, but I also think that what I would hope for is basically a savvier understanding of metaphor. So one way of conceiving of pre-modernity is a overly, almost like a very savvy understanding of metaphor, but it kind of was running wild. Everything was being linked to everything else via metaphor and analogy, and without a kind of a stable reference point. Whereas then modernity's intellectual project was about establishing fixed and stable reference points. This is
right.
We could associate with science, for example, and maybe certain strands of philosophy, and that became predominant. And I think the hope would be to synthesize the two more, so that there's more kind of explicit understanding of how metaphor works. I think that's one thing that I'm very focused on in my work with the ego death theory is that pursuing metaphor and pursuing the topic of metaphor and its I guess its importance, what Michael has to say about metaphor and analogy, the importance of that for intellectual discourse about not just intellectual discourse, just like discourse in general, life in general about these topics. So that's something that I would hope for, and I think that, but then that again, you've really posed it as two separate questions of ending prohibition and then the ego death theory as two separate questions. And I think my fear with a lot of the pop psychedelia and drug policy reform narrative is that they are... My fear is that they need something like the ego death theory in order to actually do their work of trying to repeal prohibition and set up a post-prohibition culture. I say fear because that makes the problem very large and suggests instead, we need, to what extent do we need people to take up the ego death theory? That would be a hard criterion to demand first, and I don't think it's really necessary. So I think that's, I don't know. That's my fear, is that without that kind of clear-eyed view of like what the kind of what altered state initiation is all about, and eternalism initiation and the altered state of consciousness is really all about for the mind. Without that clear-eyed view, then people end up going off into other goals and get distracted into other goals, such as all the goals put forward by pop-psychedelia as the real point of taking psychedelics is to do all this other stuff. So that's my fear, but I I don't know, what do you like. It does seem like I'm just trying to define what this fear is that I have. The fear is that people need something like the ego death theory, otherwise they'll get drawn off course into lots of other topics or reasons for using psychedelics that don't promote the end of drug prohibition.
But it sounds like what you're describing there is precisely just pop psych. It's trying to understand what psychedelics are for without the ego death theory. So it's like, well, I guess the issue you're raising is, what would the future of pop psych be in a post-prohibition world? Yeah, I mean, maybe we would need to know the true chronology in order to really address any of these questions. What does come first? Does the end of prohibition come before there's a kind of spreading a broader awareness of the ego death theory, or does the awareness of the ego death theory come first? And also, does pop psych and their line of inquiry and discovery have anything to do with the eventual end of prohibition? Like, we don't know any of these issues, so we can't really, we're not in a position to say what that world would be like, because it depends on whether they've got the ego death theory or whether there's still such a thing as pop psych. But I think that regarding the religion issue, I think what you're saying there is that you would hope, at least, that there would be reasons to continue to embrace and use metaphor even after even when the society is in a position to explicitly reveal to itself the meaning of the metaphor. There might still be reasons to continue using them. And I think that's also the case for the function of exoteric religion, because it definitely has a social cohesion function, which is valuable and useful for a lot of people's lives. I felt a couple of times in the past when people have been trying to initiate me to convert me to religions, whether it's Christianity or Islam, that what they're trying to tempt me and pull me into is a kind of social group, like a ready-made group of friends, a ready-made social circle that you can just go and relate to, which is a very important thing in people's lives. And that's very much to do with the social everyday dimension, completely separate from the altered state dimension of what religion is about. So I think that, it's not the end of prohibition doesn't necessarily spell the end of exoteric religion and the use of metaphor to convey religious ideas.
No, because people, I mean, what you're pointing out is that there are different religious groups that cohere around. Also, they take certain ways of putting religious ideas and certain images as kind of a focal point for their social group, and that there are different. That's one way that metaphor, for example, or all the images that have been created could survive, is through that. And also, I think there's still so let's say that psychedelics become reintegrated into mainstream religious practices across religions. Even if there were a explicit theory of metaphor in this post-prohibition time when psychedelics are integrated into religious practice again. Even if there is an explicit, teaching of the metaphor, that's still very different from the actual experience of going through the altered state initiation and of grasping the metaphor. I mean, there's a great difference between the discourse about the metaphors and what they represent, and the analogy, and then the actual experience of going through that. One thing, it reminds me of one thing in some of his later writings that are now hidden in the Yahoo group. Michael Hoffman wrote some things about that. It's not, he took a position at a certain point that you can imagine that there are people who are not going to experience the psychedelics and the full ego death, but as long as they comprehend how the metaphor analogy works and comprehend comprehend in words the system of ego death and eternalism, etc., and what effect that has on self-control, that in a way that's there was a certain time where he was writing about how that's almost more important for him. I don't want to misquote him here. It's frustrating because I don't have that to refer to anymore now that the Yahoo group is hidden by Yahoo.
Are you saying more important to understand the concept, that how metaphor works?
Well, I don't want to ascribe those more important words to him. I don't remember right now. But there was some discussion about the almost a distinction between, not a distinction, but kind of two classes almost. People who get it intellectually. That is the most important thing, is whether people get the ego death theory intellectually and its description of what happens in religion and religious initiation, more than the actual experiencing of it.
So it wouldn't be necessary for every single member of the population to go through their own ego death initiation, as long as the understanding was widespread.
And the same thing with this Eucharist is, so to speak, in a Christian example, this Eucharist is the psychedelic, or we understand that this Eucharist represents the psychedelic.
Right, because after all, that Eucharist and the variants of it are totally omnipresent in the exoteric religious celebrations. Like at nearly every religious event, there's some kind of meal, some kind of eating or drinking.
Across religions.
Yeah, I mean, whatever, even within religions at different times of the year, different seasonal events. There's always, it so often centers around an event of eating and drinking. So that the idea is, could that continue to be the exoteric eating and drinking of inert bread and wine or fish or what have you? Or would it have to be a case where, in every case where you're celebrating religion, you have to use the psychedelic sacrament?
You have to trip.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. That seems like a tall bar.
So, but what you're suggesting is that that would be less. That wouldn't be required to be sufficient for the full transformation of society, because you could just continue to play along with the metaphor, but just understand it as such, rather than taking every instance of the metaphor as a instance of full initiatory, psychedelic tripping. So exoteric religion could continue largely unaffected by this. I think we're trying to kind of work out whether that would be possible, and I think we're both saying that it could be possible that exoteric religion would continue largely, just maybe not completely.
But in some ways, we're also talking about what do we think our goals are, or not our goals, but the kind of it's just, what, I don't know, what do we want society to look like? With this, taking this ego death theory as a standpoint, as a clear basis of our thoughts about that. What's necessary, what's not necessary, and what is, it seems to me that I think for me, something I've long thought is that we have to have psychedelics have to be available. We cannot demonize them and continue to act like they're, continue to legalize them and punish people for using them. I think that's one thing, that's like an axiom I take as a kind of basis for societal change. Like that can't continue, that shouldn't continue. And then secondarily, there's the idea of spreading the ideas of, like, hey, all this religion stuff that you're interpreting one way, well, there is also this way of interpreting it that completes it and makes sense of it finally. And you've got to take that on and understand that if you want to practice religion or claim it. This is what people were doing in pre-modernity with these religious traditions. And this is kind of what this is the kind of the way the human mind works with regards to religion and enlightenment and revelation and these ideas.
Yeah, because I think you could say that the social cohesion model of what religion is for is actually explicitly disingenuous, because so you've got a role of religion where it unites you with other people and it gives you a ready-made social grouping, which many people, I think, use exoteric religion for that function.
Right.
But it's not what religion is supposed to be about on the face of it. Religion is not meant to be about uniting you with your fellow man. Rather, it's supposed to be about uniting you with God. And that social role of religion doesn't really do that. I mean, I think that maybe Christians would argue against that. Exoteric Christians, that is, would say that by coming into the social grouping, you are actually, that's the body of Christ. So that movement into the social grouping is becoming a part of the body of Christ, which is literally what religion is supposed to be about. But it's just only really from our point of view that we would say that social cohesion, social grouping is an entirely different thing from the sense of uniting with God that is entailed by deep ego death experience, deep hardcore psychedelic experiencing. It's a completely different realm.
Right. I think that we would say that the social cohesion aspects come out of, there are maybe what we'd say sociological explanations for why religions have those. More than, the Christian example of banding together to, come, like a sociological explanation is that arises in some part from the context of being counter Roman Empire, for example. And so getting together in a group has that social goal as well of creating an in-group that's against that out-group, the larger Roman Empire. But you'd have the same thing in different, for different religions. I mean, I think that there is a lot of value to having that sociological, so to speak, explanation. But that, again, it doesn't, the real mental dynamics happen between each individual within that group and the control source. Yeah, I think we'd be clear on that's not a criterion. Social cohesion is not a criterion for religion. It doesn't have to be there for authentic religion to occur.
No, not at all. I'm wondering though if the extent to which the existence of exoteric religion in the modern world can be explained by the social aspect of it. In other words, why do people need exoteric religion in the first place? Maybe it arises because of that. People are using a framework and a set of stories that were designed to metaphorically describe psychedelic initiation and have this counter empire political strategy, but they're using it as a way of creating a shared narrative to create a social environment, which is not what it was originally created for, but that's what it is being used for in the modern context, in the exoteric context. So I just wonder if there's any possibility that exoteric religion and esoteric religion are fundamentally incompatible, and whether it would still be possible to use religion in the old-fashioned way once the psychedelic understanding has come into the society.
right, it becomes, well, then what's the point of any specific metaphor system, right? Any specific set of stories? Do they, what's the point of having loyalty towards one or the other? From a religious perspective, from a true religious perspective, per the ego theory, per the mystical state, what's the point of adhering to one metaphor system now that we have reached a stage of culture where we can kind of survey them all and evaluate them? What's the point of one or the other? Or, it would be better to come up with an entirely new one, or not a new one. That's kind of a pre-modern pipe dream, is to think of, we'll make a new one that will serve other purposes. Perhaps that's not needed, because then it starts to get into like, what are the social goals, which then people are going to have different social goals. That's not specifically something that I think we, speaking from, trying to speak from within the ego death theory and its concerns, really can talk about. I think that's why I'm trying to keep a lot of my thinking about social goals really just, it seems to me that the problem of prohibition and this prohibitionist culture, now I'm kind of interested in expanding that slightly to a prohibitionist mindset. That's what I'm taking as being the specific social goal in this time and place of ending that or moving beyond it, both the prohibitionist laws and a kind of a prohibitionist type of culture that's focused on safety and security primarily.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah.
Do you see that? That's one of the few things I think seems like an appropriate social movement, because it has to do with denying or putting off or avoiding ego death. Now, you could even have a social movement focused on safety and security, as long as it understood and allowed for the ego death initiation. So that's my complaint. We have a social setup primarily, and it seems to me a culture that doesn't allow that. It doesn't permit it, doesn't talk about it, it tries to avoid it and put it off and substitute other goals in its place.
Right, so there are two things that we're identifying as being bad and that we would want to be eliminated by an end of prohibition. One of them is this, what you call as prohibition culture, which is obsessed with safety and cocooning everybody in a kind of bed of softness and safety, preventing them from ever coming to any harm.
Yeah, and staying in their present state, staying in their egoic, and preserving that present state, non-transformative.
And then the other thing would be this enforcement wing, which is basically amounts to groups of nasty thugs wearing uniforms, breaking your front door down at 3:00 in the morning. That also is something that, regardless of anything else that may or may not change pre and post prohibition, you would hope that those two things would be eliminated. So I just want to, as a kind of idea experimentation, just lay out in a similar kind of way that James Kent formulated his anthropological theories, which then progress into a justification of prohibition. I just want to spell out what I see as a progression in different social models relating to the age in a person's life where initiation would happen, and then concomitantly the way in which ego develops in an individual's lifetime within each of these three social structures. So the first of them appeals to the writings of people like Christian Ratch and also Terence McKenna, the anthropologically minded psychedelic thinkers who go and look at what we would call primitive cultures or tribal cultures or rainforest cultures or that kind of thing. And there's this classical image of people who hardly wear any clothes and they just walk about naked with face paints and huge earrings and that kind of thing in rainforests. We think of these people as being primitive. And I've read, I think it's in Christian Ratch saying that in cultures like that, say in South America, when a baby is born, they will put ayahuasca onto the baby's lips even before the mother's breast and the breast milk goes to the baby's lips, to acclimatize them to that taste, which is going to be like a major part of their life, something that they're routinely doing in their tribal way of life. So in other words, there's no delay of initiation whatsoever. And you could then argue, theorizing about psychological structure, that ego never really forms. In the mind of a person who has been having psychedelic ingestion since they were a baby, since literally as soon as they arrive in the world, the first thing they taste is ayahuasca, that ego would not ever form in the same sense in such a person. So therefore, there would be no formation of ego, and then there would be no dramatic ego death, dramatic disproof of deep-set, rigidly structured egoic logic like we observe in modern ego death initiations. So that's the tribal, the anthropological societal model. Moving on from that into, I guess, the antiquity model that Michael Hoffman lays out as being what the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans and ancient Egyptians, people in those kind of cultures, it wouldn't be the same as the anthropological style because they don't have it from birth. It's something which people are initiated into in adolescence, after ego has had a chance to form. So there then would be some kind of dramatic ego death experience. And in that model of society, the awareness of psychedelia and the development of ego follows a very similar pattern to the way that we, in the modern Western setting, the way that we introduce individuals to sexuality. So it's the ultimate taboo in modern society to mix sexuality with pre-adolescence. That's like the worst possible thing that you can do. Absolutely hideous. No one even wants to talk about that or address what that's all about. It's just simply evil and bad. So you keep sexuality hidden from people until they reach an age of, say, like 16 or 18, and then it becomes legal and accepted for them to discover sexuality. So I'm comparing that picture to psychedelic discovery in antiquity, where it wouldn't happen at the very beginning of life, but it would happen after ego has had a chance to form. So it's delayed initiation, but not delayed forever. And then jumping forward from that into the modern setting, where you have prohibition and initiation is delayed perpetually. So the ego structure forms, and then ego death never happens in the life of a normal person because they never take psychedelics. So does that make sense? Like, in terms of there's those three, that's a progression from 1, 2 to 3. Like, there's a sequence of the degree to which initiation is delayed in those three societal models. Do you think this is kind of relevant to this analysis?
Yeah, excuse me. Yes, absolutely. You know, it strikes me with the modern analogy. Yeah, the normal modern person, that it puts it off, and people end up not experiencing that or having any conception of that. And then I think even a lot of people who have taken psychedelics don't have may experience ego death initiation, but I mean, for example, like we were concluding about James Kent, that it seems like he was an initiate into ego death control loss, but then ran away from it and from comprehending it fully and putting it into words and incorporating it into his thinking. So that's part of that's part of modernity's setup of putting off.
Yes, right.
Prohibitionist modernity. Putting off is also then, people who do experience it they are either officially shunted aside, or their talk is shunted aside, or they do it to themselves and censor themselves, and disbelieve what they have experienced or discount it or denigrate it. Whereas so we could imagine a post-prohibition future. What does that look like? I mean, how do you think that these models affect our hypothesizing or our projections about potential futures?
I guess, yeah, if that's an arrow pointing in one direction, then what would be the fourth position on that trajectory? What happens next?
Right. Well, I think I've so much it is interesting to hear you put those out, because I think I have internalized so much that model 2 of you that you described, of it being analogous to sex, to discovering sexual relations. That there's allow a time period for ego to develop and for things to be the full experience to be hidden and put off, and then at a certain point initiate the person. I think that's been my kind of working idea of how things should be or ought to be, is to allow an ego to develop in the kind of modern, especially now after the modern experience of prohibition, allow that to develop to a certain age, even if you understand or know at a certain younger age that there is this experience to be had. Then undergo it at a certain point in late adolescence, once the ego structures have been really developed in the mind, and then go on being an adult who understands those, has experienced also those things, and can repeat them or something ad libitum.
Sorry, what was that? What was the last thing you said?
Oh, sorry. Ad libitum. It's that's some of my Latin background coming out. That means whenever you want, for the sake of pleasure, basically.
Yeah. But so, I mean, do you think it's right to say that in the first situation, the kind of tribal rainforest situation, there wouldn't ever be a dramatic ego death at later in life, because there would be no ego structure to be destroyed like that?
That's interesting. I haven't not thought about that, but that's interesting. Is that partly coming out of, I haven't read Christian Ra too much detail. I have one of his books somewhere, but is that coming out of an observation that on the differences between tribal societies, so-called primitive or pre-modernish tribal societies, and modern or Western society, and that there is no kind of ego individual self in that way in those societies?
Yeah, because if people have been taking psychedelics since a very, very young age, that there would be, that the ego correction would have always been happening. So there would have been no chance for the ego mistake to have built up into adolescence.
Right. You don't develop the structure in the same way as, say, the ancient Greeks, Romans, Egyptians, etc. across the world, in other parts of the world, did.
Yeah, because it's just a simple modification of the age of initiation and the degree of. I mean, that bit about the ego not forming, that didn't actually come from Christian Ratch. He just said the thing about how in some tribal societies they give ayahuasca to the babies, and I was just kind of expanding on that to a bit of pop psychology, just some kind of free-flowing psychological theorizing about whether or not maybe that's not possible, but I just kind of imagine it that.
Well, as modeling, I understand your point as modeling. You imagine a society without any ego. How would that be possible? Without the development of that, and then you have the middle ground, and then you have in which there is ego, and then it's broken down and transcended and switched, and then you have the modern, in which the ego is predominant. For most people, there is no transition. And then for even people who there is a transition, there's often a rejection of that transition. People reject their initiation experiences or divert them into other things.
Yeah, that seems to be a forward-moving arrow, and then it points to a potential question mark, which is a fourth position, which we are trying to fill in the blanks of what that fourth position might involve. So in post-prohibition world, do they go back to the tribal model and carry out initiation straight away, or do they go more back to the antiquity model? Because you mentioned earlier that you don't think that it would simply be a reversal and able to go back to practicing things. Yes. In the way that they did in antiquity. I mean, is all really amounts to speculation.
Do you imagine that it's a developmental? Is that part of this? The idea that you're putting forward is there's a development from that. The tribal society never moved past into that idea of putting off ego death for a certain time, and then, because I certainly think there's a connection between the 2 and 3 that. The way that 2 put off, and hid ego death for a certain period of time. Well, once you withdraw the psychedelics from that and withdraw normal initiation from that, then you end up in 3. That seems to be my understanding of, say, the progress of the so-called West and other religions and cultures, is that they moved from that initiation model at a certain time, then withdrew the initiation, the authentic initiation, and you're left simply with the exoteric and then ego model of number 3 with a few hidden initiations in there. And then so what do you move into in the fourth one? Is there a completely new state? Is it a combination of the 3 or of the 2? I mean, this idea of giving psychedelics to babies is a new idea to me.
I guess I'm just fully spelling out what you left me with at the end of our last recording, like the thoughts in my head. It leads me to this kind of, and I think I'm consciously modeling this after James Kent in the way that he models a progression of society from psychedelic to post-psychedelic. And I guess I'm just trying to push that model forwards and think, what would post-psychedelic look like? Given your modeling of prohibition culture and the way that pop-psych props that up, it's just speculation about the future, really. Just trying to just make sure that I fully understand the full ramifications of this prohibition culture concept.
Well, again, I'm trying to take them. What does the ego death theory add to that third model? I mean, the ego death theory comes out of that third model, and in some ways Michael Hoffman has presented it as the end of that third model. It is the initiation trigger for that modern egoic context in which initiation never happens or is hidden and put off. Well, that work in the ego death theory is meant to bring initiation front and center and describe it in ways that moderns can understand, right? With its kind of more science-oriented, clear language-oriented, really as non-metaphorical as possible orientation. So then it seems like that idea is to, I mean, let's imagine that everyone reads at some point the ego death theory, okay? Let's imagine everyone reads it, everyone has to read it at some point, or something like that. So what happens? Well, even if people who don't experience initiation are meant to have an understanding of what is going on in that ego death experience. So there's this greater understanding. Many people may go through life without experiencing ego death, but they would understand at least.
So that the understanding would remove the need for the first-hand understanding. It's like, sure, anybody who wanted to could still do that, but it would be rendered largely unnecessary. You could still get the full benefit without actually having the experience, according to that idealized model. Which seems a bit strange. It almost seems like I'm saying that the ego death theory means that psychedelic experience is no longer needed by anybody because you've got the theory which explains it, so you don't really need the experience anymore. You can have it if you want, the experience is always going to be available, but the ego death theory renders it essentially unnecessary. You can still get the full benefit of the experience without having the experience.
Well, that's a question. Is that possible? Is it possible to get the, and we're talking about benefit, and which is a tricky topic then. Is there a categorical difference between understanding the discourse about something? The Ida theory is in words, and there's an element of actual experiencing for each individual that it can't capture because of that. And so is there a categorical difference between understanding it in words without experiencing it, as opposed to experiencing it and understanding it in words? I think so. There has to be some sort of difference, I think, and what that means for each and every individual is not something I think we can prescribe. As in, I wouldn't want to say, well, you haven't, you may understand it, but you haven't experienced it, so you have to experience it. I don't know if we want to go that far or not.